Valid to further the case for the proposition.
At first, when I got the request to talk on this, I needed to think quite hard. I mean, essentially, probably you can accuse me of sleeping with the enemy. My wife was both trained in the humanities and is a practicing artist, so essentially it's a bit of a difficult position I was put in. She's not here, so that's good. Okay? Nevertheless, I think the whole motion hinges on what we really mean with better than. Okay? Those two words really are the crux of what we need to address. And depending on what we mean with it, we can either agree with the motion or disagree with the motion. And Neil has given one example, clearly, of what he thinks very personally. I'll try to give you a few things I believe are important to decide whether science could be better than arts and humanities. Now, the first one, which already been touched on by the previous speaker, was the issue of what I would call the utilitarian argument. Essentially, is science useful? Now, clearly, that's always a two-edged sword. As you saw on the projection we had on the screen before we came in, there were some statements being made over there whether stuff is good or bad. I mean, the do no harm issue. I mean, the morality. Now, science in itself is not a moral subject, and it's already quite tricky because moral is clearly a philosophical concept. So we already go slightly to the other side. But let me nevertheless argue that in modern society, when I came in, there were a number of you sitting around with their laptops. The transistor, which is clearly the main driver of all modern electronics, which was invented, well, a little over 50 years ago in Bell Labs, was a real physics invention and has transformed the world. For the better, for the worse. That's clearly a statement we need to make. I believe for the better, okay? I mean, clearly what we can do now in society, we can do a large number of things better. Does it also have side effects? You bet they have. Okay, I mean, like medicine. So are those side effects important? I don't know. You have to decide. But even something like the Humble ballpoint on my desk is essentially a scientific invention, and I think, my God, it beats writing this book still 100 times. So clearly science has made a major impact on our daily lives. So I think for me, you can definitely have that utilitarian argument that science is better. So that's one of the ways you can think. But it does have its negatives as well. The second one has to do with science or humanities and arts as an intellectual challenge. I mean, is one a better intellectual challenge than the other? Well, let me give you an example. I mean, when we say call something difficult, we say, or not difficult, we say it's not rocket science. That suggests essentially already that science is the challenge. I was listening to the Today program a couple of days ago when Brian Cox and Jeff Forshaw were trying to essentially politely sell their new book, okay, essentially. But they were talking about quantum mechanics and the intellectual challenges of something as difficult as quantum mechanics, and convincing, I think it was John Humphreys, but I don't remember which Today presenter was, really got lost in their discussion of particles being at two places at the same time. Which is a possibility, we have proven it, but essentially it's a type of intellectual question that science can ask, which is different than the pure human-based questions that an art or humanity can do. I mean, essentially, art is something that is produced by a human being and essentially, hopefully, reflects the human mind. Science may reflect some of the human mind, but really reflects nature around us. So essentially, it could be deemed better than that. I mean, one of the very deep questions that people can ask, and I mean, as somebody who's been trained at least in ancient Greek as well. I mean, essentially, if you go back to Plato, I mean, essentially the deep questions about existence, the deep questions, and Socrates, the deep questions about existence and life are important. But these days, I would argue, the deepest questions about how we came to be here are no longer asked by philosophy, they're asked by science. They're asked by places like cosmology, I mean, how did the universe start? They're asked by issues like chemistry, essentially, I mean, how is stuff built? Biochemistry, how do biological molecules form, biology, how do we work, and maybe even up to the level of functional MRI, how does our brain respond to something? It's a science answer to the question. It's no longer an answer on that way. So on that level, I would argue that science is better. Science is really a way we use to describe the world around us. So it's not a world created by us, it's the world that essentially we can see. Now, I can discuss with the philosopher what seeing means, and we'll probably be here until kingdom comes, because it's a difficult question to ask. But essentially, there is an important question to ask, that we really take input from the outside and try to describe that as well as we can. So we're really trying to do stuff without making assumptions about it, without putting ourselves into it as much as we can. So science is a very different approach to life, to the world around us, and I think an important one. It gives an important way to look at it. In some sense, the analogy I make is that humanities and art are important, but they're something like the icing on the cake. I can have a cake without icing, but it's not very nice to have the icing without the cake. Okay? I like humanities. I read history, I read philosophy, I teach students the philosophy of physics even, okay? To a certain extent. But with the emphasis on the physics, not the philosophy, which is clearly a slightly different viewpoint. So I do believe that essentially that art and humanities really just describe what humans do, human activity, whereas we try to understand the world around us much deeper and also provide value to that world at the same time. So for that reason, I hope you support the motion.